This is a story about a woman who was told her life was over and the man who didn't care when it was supposed to have started. It's a story about how the world sees a woman of 38 as a finished book, its pages yellowed and its story told, while a man of the same age is just getting to the good part. Ilara Vance was that book, left on a shelf to gather dust in her own father's house. When she finally took a desperate chance, lying about her age to a stranger 1,000 miles away, she wasn't looking for love. She was looking for a single patch of ground where her own 2 feet could stand without apology. The man she wrote to, a rancher named Silas Blackwood, was expecting a girl of 20, all soft hands and future children. What he got was Ilara, with silver in her hair and a life's worth of disappointment in her eyes. And the funny thing is, the thing you have to understand to know the heart of this story is that when he saw her, truly saw her, he smiled. It wasn't the smile you give a pretty thing. It was the smile you give a survivor. If you want to know how a lie can lead to the truest thing in a person's life, you'll want to stay for this one. This is her story. The humiliation was a quiet thing, delivered over lukewarm tea in the dim parlor that had been Ilara's entire world for 2 decades. Her father, John Vance, a man whose spine had softened as his pronouncements had grown more brittle, stirred his cup without looking at her. At 38, Ilara knew the precise sound of that spoon against the porcelain. It was the sound of a decision already made, a verdict rendered without her testimony. She had spent 20 years caring for him after her mother passed, running his failing mercantile with a sharp mind he never acknowledged, and keeping a house that had become more a museum of her servitude than a home. Her younger sister, Clara, prettier and infinitely more charming, had married a wealthy merchant from back east and escaped. Ilara had stayed. She had been the good daughter, the dutiful one. That was her role, her purpose. Now, it seemed, her role was being discontinued. Mr. Covington, Clara's husband, has made a generous offer for the store, her father said, finally setting the spoon down. He feels it's time I retired. I'll be moving in with them. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating as dust motes. Ilara waited for the rest of it, for the part about her. It didn't come. "And what are the arrangements for me, Father?" she asked, her voice steady, a trick she'd learned long ago. He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there was not malice, but a weary impatience. The impatience of a man shrugging off a burden he no longer wished to carry. "Ilara, you are a grown woman. It is long past time you made your own way." Clara thought perhaps a position as a companion to the widow Hemlock. She is in need of someone. A companion. A paid servant to an old woman. After 20 years of unpaid service to him. The dregs of her life to be poured out for someone else's comfort. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, not because it was loud, but because it was so casual. He had erased her. Her years of balancing his ledgers, of coaxing credit from suppliers, of tending to his gout and his temper, all of it vanished. She was simply an obstacle to his comfortable decline. "I see," she said. And she did. She saw it all with a clarity that felt like a physical blow. She was not his daughter. She was a piece of furniture he was leaving behind with the house. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her small, cold room, the one overlooking the alley, and felt the walls closing in. She had no money of her own, save a small cache of coins saved from the egg money she'd secretly kept for years. It wasn't enough for a life. It was barely enough for a journey. It was in her mother's old sewing box, beneath a tangle of thread, that she found it. A page torn from a newspaper months ago. Wives wanted for prosperous ranchers in Montana Territory. Men of good standing seeking hardy, honorable women for partnership in life. Must be of good character and strong constitution. Ages 18 to 25 preferred. The words swam before her eyes. It was a fool's hope, a desperate gamble. But what was she leaving behind? A life of being invisible. She took out a pen, her hand shaking only slightly. She had a photograph, a daguerreotype taken when she was 21. Her face was smoother then, her eyes full of a hope she no longer recognized. It would have to do. She began to write, her words careful and plain. She spoke of her skills in housekeeping, in gardening, in bookkeeping. She presented herself as a capable partner, and at the bottom, where it asked for her age, she paused for a long moment. Then she dipped the pen and wrote the biggest lie of her life. 21 years of age. She sealed the envelope and sent it off with her egg money, a prayer whispered into the vast, indifferent expanse of the American West. It was not a request for love. It was a plea for existence. The train ride was 3 days of clattering wheels and coal smoke, a journey that stripped away the last of her old life with every mile. The woman who stepped onto the platform in dusty Redemption, Montana, was not the trembling ghost who had left Ohio. She was a woman who had wagered everything on a single, desperate hope. She smoothed the front of her plain gray dress, her hands steady, and scanned the small crowd. She was looking for a man named Silas Blackwood. She expected to be met with immediate dismissal, a harsh word, and a ticket back to the nothing she'd come from. A man detached himself from the wall of the station. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in worn denim and leather, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the unforgiving landscape around them. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, found hers and held. He wasn't looking at her with expectation, but with a kind of grim assessment. This had to be him. She walked toward him, her small carpet bag clutched in one hand. As she drew closer, she saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes. He was taking in the fine lines around her mouth, the threads of silver at her temples that the dim light of the train car had hidden. He was doing the math. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her voice clear. "I am Elara Vance." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His gaze didn't waver. "The letter said you were 21. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, as plain and solid as a fence post. There was no point in denying it. The truth was written on her face. "The letter was a lie," she said, just as plainly. "I am 38. She braced herself for the anger, the disgust. Instead, he just kept looking at her, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be seeing past the lie, past the age, to the core of her. To the woman who had crossed a continent on a desperate gamble. After a silence that stretched until it was threadbare, a corner of his mouth lifted in a ghost of a smile. It was a strange, weary thing, holding no romance, no delight. It was a smile of grim acknowledgement, of recognition. "Well, I'll be," he said, the words a low rumble. "You came all this way to tell the truth to my face." He gestured to the dusty buckboard wagon waiting nearby. "The ad was for a wife. Can you work? Can you keep a house standing and a garden growing? I don't have room for fine manners, and I don't have time for hysterics." This was it. Not a proposal, but an interview. Not a promise of affection, but a contract for labor. It was more honest than anything her father had said to her in 20 years. "I can work," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I've done little else my whole life. I can keep a house and I can keep books better than any man you've ever met. And I promise you, Mr. Blackwood, you will never see hysterics from me." He nodded again, a gesture of finality. "The circuit judge comes through in 2 weeks. We'll make it legal then. Until that time, you'll have the spare room. My foreman's wife, Martha, can stay up at the house for propriety's sake if it matters to you." "It doesn't," Ilara said. Propriety was a luxury for women with choices. "Good," he said, and for the first time, he reached out and took her bag. The weight of it left her hand, and the simple gesture felt monumental. He wasn't sending her back. He was taking her home. As he loaded her single bag onto the wagon, she realized the smile hadn't been for her. It had been for the situation, for the sheer, unvarnished audacity of it all. He had advertised for a sapling and gotten a storm-weathered oak, and for reasons she couldn't begin to fathom, he seemed to think that might be a fair trade. The Blackwood Ranch was not a place of comfort. It was a place of relentless function. The house was solid, built of thick pine logs, but inside it was a shell, clean but barren. It was a house a man had kept, not a home a family had lived in. The air was thick with the ghosts of silence and solitude. Silas gave her a brief tour, his words clipped and practical. "Stove draws well if the wind's from the west. Pumps outside the door. Root cellar's there. My room's at the end of the hall. Yours is here." Her room was small, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over an endless expanse of brown grass and bruised purple mountains. It was more than she'd had before. It was a space that was hers. Her proving ground began the next morning before the sun had even crested the horizon. The first test was the wood stove, a cast-iron beast that seemed to mock her with its silent, cold refusal to cooperate. Back home, they had a modern coal furnace. Here, she struggled with kindling and draft, her hands quickly covered in soot. She heard Silas moving about, the heavy tread of his boots a constant reminder of her audience. Just as tears of frustration pricked her eyes, she refused them. She was not a hysterical woman. She remembered watching a blacksmith once, how he controlled the air to his forge. She adjusted the flue, fed the fire a little at a time, and was finally rewarded with a steady, roaring flame. The small victory felt as significant as crossing the Rockies. The work was endless and punishing. She learned the brutal arithmetic of a rancher's life, the garden that had to be coaxed from dry, stubborn soil, the mending of clothes and tack that never ceased, the constant battle against dust that seeped through every crack. Silas never offered praise. His approval was measured in what he didn't say. He didn't complain when the bread was a little dense. He didn't comment when the stew was blander than he liked. He simply ate, his focus on the fuel, not the flavor. His foreman, a wiry old man named Jeb, was openly skeptical. He'd watch her from the corner of his eye as she hauled water or wrestled with laundry in a tub of harsh lye soap. His wife, Martha, was kind but pitying. They were all waiting for her to break. The first turning point came a month in. Silas and Jeb were out on the range, dealing with a rustler problem, and wouldn't be back for 2 days. A sudden, vicious storm blew in, the kind of late-spring blizzard that could kill a herd. Ilara was alone with Finn, the young, quiet ranch hand, who was barely 16. One of the heifers was in labor, and it was going wrong. The calf was breached. Finn was panicked. "We'll lose 'em both, ma'am," he stammered, his face pale in the lantern light. Ilara looked at the struggling animal, then at the boy. She was not a rancher's daughter. She was a merchant's. But she had seen the vet work back in Ohio, and she was a quick study. "Get me the rope from the tack room," she ordered, her voice calm and firm. "And hot water, as hot as you can make it." For the next hour, in the howling wind of the barn, she worked. She washed her hands and arms raw, and with a strength born of pure desperation, she helped turn the calf inside its mother. It was brutal, bloody work. At last, with one final, agonizing pull, the calf slid free. For a terrifying moment, it lay still. Ilara cleared its airway and rubbed its small body vigorously with a rough burlap sack. It gave a weak bleat and struggled to lift its head. When Silas returned, he found the new mother contentedly licking her healthy calf in a bed of clean straw. Finn told him the whole story, his voice full of awe. Silas looked at Ilara, at her chapped and reddened hands, and for the first time, his gaze held something other than assessment. It was a flicker of respect. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The second victory was quieter. She found his account books in a dusty crate. They were a chaotic mess of scrawled notes and receipts. She spent 3 nights by lamplight, organizing, calculating, creating a proper ledger. She discovered he was being overcharged by a supplier in redemption. By consolidating his orders and proposing a bulk purchase with a neighboring ranch, she calculated they could save nearly $200 a year, a small fortune. She didn't present it as a criticism. She simply left the new, neat ledger on his desk with a note outlining the proposal. The next time he went to town, he did exactly as she'd suggested. He returned and set a small paper bag on the kitchen table. Inside was a bar of scented rose soap. It was the first gift she had ever received that wasn't a hand-me-down. She was earning her place not with feminine wiles or youthful beauty, but with the competence and grit he had recognized in her from the very first moment. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She was becoming a partner. The arrival of the black lacquered carriage was as out of place on the dusty ranch road as a diamond on a dung heap. Ilara was hanging laundry, the harsh Montana wind whipping the sheets, when she saw it approaching. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, who was inside. Out stepped a man in a tailored city suit, his shoes polished to an absurd sheen. This was Arthur Covington, her sister Clara's husband, and trailing behind him, looking lost and diminished against the vast landscape, was her father. Covington's smile was all teeth and condescension. He surveyed the simple ranch house, the corrals, the endless sky, as if it were a particularly distasteful specimen under glass. "Ilara, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and oiled. "We came as soon as we could. Your father has been worried to death." Her father wouldn't meet her eye. He just stood there, a stooped and pathetic figure, a prop in Covington's little play. "I am not in any trouble, Arthur," Ilara said, her voice even. She refused to let them see her tremble. "This is my home." Covington chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "A home? My dear, this is a hovel on the edge of nowhere. Clara was beside herself when your letter arrived, married to some frontiersman without a word to your family. It was a shock, I assure you." He was a master of social coercion, his words designed to shame, to isolate, to make her feel small and foolish. He was using her family's concern as a weapon. At that moment, Silas rode in from the north pasture. He dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the scene. The fancy carriage, the city man, Ilara standing stiff and pale by the clothesline. He didn't speak, just moved to stand near her, a silent, solid presence at her back. Covington turned his patronizing gaze on Silas. "You must be Mr. Blackwood. I am Arthur Covington. I've come to take my sister-in-law home. There has been a terrible misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Silas said, his voice flat. "She's my wife." "A marriage based on a deception," Covington countered smoothly, playing his trump card. "She lied about her age, did she not? A court would see that as fraud. The union could be easily annulled. We are prepared to take that step to save Ilara from this unfortunate situation." He turned back to Ilara, his voice softening into a parody of kindness. "Come home, Ilara. We have a place for you. You can be a governess to our children. A respectable position. You don't belong here." It was the same offer as before, dressed up in finer clothes. A servant, a dependent. He was trying to buy her back into her cage. Her father finally spoke, his voice thin and reedy. "He's right, daughter. Think of your reputation. This life, it's not for you. Come back with us." For a moment, the old weight of obligation settled on her shoulders, the ingrained habit of obedience. But then she looked at Silas. He wasn't looking at Covington. He was looking at her, his expression unwavering. He was leaving the choice entirely to her. He would not fight for her if she did not wish to be fought for. That was his way. That was his respect. She lifted her chin. "My reputation is my own concern, and my life is here." She looked directly at Covington, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "I will not be your governess. I will not be your charity case. I am Mrs. Blackwood. And this," she said, gesturing to the simple house, the dusty yard, "is my home. You are not welcome here. Please leave." Covington's mask of civility slipped. A flash of anger crossed his face. He had expected a wilting spinster, easily intimidated. He had not expected this woman. "You will regret this," he hissed. "I will not," Ilara said. It was a promise. As the carriage turned, kicking up a cloud of angry dust, she felt Silas's hand briefly, almost imperceptibly, touch the small of her back. It wasn't a gesture of ownership. It was a gesture of support. A silent affirmation that said, "You stood your ground. Now I will stand with you." The external threat had arrived, and she had not buckled. But she knew this was not the end of it. Men like Arthur Covington did not accept defeat. The victory over Covington was short-lived. A pall of tension descended on the ranch, thick and suffocating. Silas retreated even further into himself, his silence growing heavier, more distant. He worked from before dawn until long after dusk, pushing himself and his horse to the point of exhaustion. He avoided the house, taking his meals on the porch, his back to the door. Ilara knew what he was doing. He was building a wall between them, brick by silent brick. He was a man accustomed to loss, and he was preparing himself for another one. He believed Covington's threats. He believed that Ilara, given the choice between this harsh, lonely life and the respectable one she'd been offered, would eventually leave. He was trying to make it easier on himself, and perhaps on her, by severing the fragile connection that had begun to grow between them. "You should think about his offer," he said one evening, his voice rough as he stared out at the darkening plains. "He can give you an easier life, a better one." "I don't want an easier life," she said, standing in the doorway. "I want this one." He flinched, as if her words were a physical blow. "You don't know what you're saying. This is a hard place. It breaks people." "It hasn't broken me," she insisted. He finally turned to look at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it stole her breath. "It broke me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It will break you too." He was pushing her away, trying to protect her from the same grief that had hollowed him out. The stalemate held for days, an agonizing stretch of shared space and separate lives. The breakthrough came, as it often does, in the dead of night. A storm had rolled in, and the sound of a horse in distress woke Alara from a restless sleep. She pulled on a robe and went out to the barn, the lantern casting dancing shadows. She found Silas not with a sick animal, but standing alone in the center of the barn, staring at something in his hands. He didn't seem to hear her approach. In his large, calloused hands, he held a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its surface worn smooth by years of touch. He was tracing the lines of it with his thumb, over and over. "Silas," she said softly. He started, his head snapping up. For a moment, he looked like a man caught in the most private act of his life. He tried to hide the wooden horse, but it was too late. The dam of his grief, so carefully constructed, finally broke. "It was my son's," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Thomas. He was 5. He sank down onto a hay bale, his broad shoulders slumping. Alara sat near him, not touching, just offering her presence as a quiet anchor in his storm of memory. "My wife, Sarah, she and Thomas, they took the fever 10 years ago. It swept through the valley. They were gone in a week." He told her everything then, the words pouring out of him in a torrent. He spoke of Sarah's laughter, the way she could make wildflowers grow in the stubborn soil. He spoke of Thomas's fascination with the horses, how he'd follow Silas everywhere, a small, sturdy shadow. Silas had carved the little horse for his 5th birthday. Thomas had never let it go. "I built this all for them," he said, his voice breaking as he gestured vaguely at the ranch around them. "Every fence post, every beam in this barn, it was supposed to be his. After they were gone, I just kept working. It was all I had left. This place isn't a home, Alara. It's a tombstone." Now she understood. His silence wasn't a rejection of her. It was a protection of them, of their memory. He was afraid of letting a new life take root in the soil of his grief, afraid it would be a betrayal, afraid he would lose it all over again. She finally reached out, her hand covering his on the little wooden horse. His skin was rough, but his hand was trembling. "It doesn't have to be a tombstone, Silas," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It can be a foundation. What you built out of love for them doesn't have to die with them. We can build something new here, together." He looked up at her then, his gray eyes shimmering with a decade of grief. He didn't pull his hand away. He leaned into her touch, a silent, desperate confession of his own profound loneliness. In the quiet of the barn, with the storm raging outside, the emotional wall between them finally crumbled to dust. He was no longer just the gruff rancher, and she was no longer just the mail-order bride. They were two broken people, finding in each other the possibility of becoming whole again. A letter arrived a week later, delivered by the mail rider. It was from a lawyer in Redemption, acting on behalf of Mr. Arthur Covington. The language was cold and formal, but the message was a declaration of war. Covington had filed a petition with the territorial court to have their marriage annulled on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. He cited the age discrepancy as clear evidence of deception, painting Alara as a desperate spinster who had tricked an honest man. The letter concluded with a final, patronizing offer. If Alara agreed to leave Montana immediately and return to Ohio under Covington's care, he would drop the legal proceedings. If not, he would see her cast out, her name publicly shamed, and her marriage declared a legal fiction. She was given 48 hours to decide. She read the letter aloud to Silas in the kitchen. The morning sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. But the room felt cold, shadowed by the threat from a world away. When she finished, Silas took the letter from her hands and read it again himself, his jaw tight. "He can't do this," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "A judge won't just dissolve a marriage." "A judge might if he's paid enough," Ilara said quietly. "Arthur is a wealthy man. He is used to getting his way. He will paint me as a liar and you as a fool." She saw the choice laid out before her with brutal clarity. On one side was Covington's offer, a return to a life of stifling safety and respectable servitude. She would be a dependent again, living under the thumb of a man who despised her strength, but she would be fed, housed, and protected from scandal. On the other side was Silas, and a life she was just beginning to build. It was a life of hard labor, of uncertainty, a life where her only protection was her own resilience and the quiet, unspoken bond she shared with this man. But it was a life of her own choosing. It was authentic. Silas crumpled the letter in his fist. "I'll fight him," he said, his eyes blazing with a protective fire she'd never seen before. "I'll hire a lawyer. We'll go to the Capitol if we have to." "And what will we pay him with?" she asked gently. "We don't have Arthur's money. We have this ranch and the work. A legal battle would ruin us, even if we won." He looked at her, the fight draining from his face, replaced by a familiar, weary despair. He saw it as a trap. He felt responsible for her, for having brought her into this. "Then you should go," he said, the words costing him everything. "He's right. I can't give you the life he can. I can't protect you from this." It was the ultimate test. He was offering her an escape, an honorable discharge from their partnership, because he believed it was what was best for her. The old Ilara, the dutiful daughter from Ohio, would have accepted. She would have bowed to the pressure, chosen the path of least resistance, and spent the rest of her life quietly regretting it. But she was not that woman anymore. Montana had scoured her down to the bone, and what was left was steel. She walked over to the stove, took the crumpled letter from his hand, and lifted the lid of the firebox. She dropped the legal threat into the flames and watched it curl into black ash. "No," she said, turning to face him. Her voice was calm, devoid of doubt. "I am not going anywhere. This is my home. You are my husband. Let him bring his lawyers and his money. I choose this. I choose you." It was a declaration, a vow more powerful than the one they'd made before the circuit judge. She was choosing the hard, uncertain, authentic path. She was choosing to fight, not with money or lawyers, but with the simple, immovable fact of her own will. For the first time, Silas Blackwood looked at her not with respect, or with gratitude, or even with affection. He looked at her with an expression of profound, heart-stopping awe. He had offered her a door out of the storm, and she had chosen to stay and face the hurricane with him. In that moment, he knew he was not just her partner or her protector. He was utterly and irrevocably in love with her. The next day was Saturday, the day the whole county came to redemption for supplies and society. Ilara knew Covington would be there, holding court in the hotel lobby, poisoning the well of public opinion against them. She could have stayed at the ranch, hidden away from the whispers and the stares. That would have been the sensible thing to do. It was also the one thing she refused to do. She put on her best dress, a simple dark blue calico she had sewn herself, and pinned her hair up with deliberate care. She was not a criminal to be hidden. She was a wife, a rancher, a member of this community, and she would act like it. When she came out of her room, Silas was waiting. He had shaved, and he was wearing a clean shirt. He hadn't asked her what she planned to do, but he knew. He was ready to stand with her. "The wagon's hitched," was all he said. The ride to town was silent, but it was a comfortable silence, a shared resolve. When they arrived, the main street was bustling. Heads turned as they pulled up in front of the general store. The whispers started immediately, a ripple of speculation that followed them as they stepped onto the boardwalk. Ilara kept her head high, her gaze fixed forward, and walked into the store with Silas at her side. Covington was there, of course. He was standing near the counter talking to the store owner and a few other prominent townspeople, his voice carrying easily. He was in the middle of a carefully crafted story about his poor, deluded sister-in-law and the uncivilized man who had taken advantage of her. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw them, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected them to cower. The store fell silent. Every eye was on them. This was the public reckoning, the trial by community gaze that Covington had engineered. He recovered quickly, his charming, pitying smile sliding back into place. "Ilara, my dear," he said loudly for all to hear. "I'm so glad you've come to your senses. My offer still stands. We can leave this unpleasantness behind us." He was framing her presence as a surrender. She took a step forward, away from Silas's side, standing on her own. She looked not at Covington, but at the faces of the townspeople watching them. The store owner's wife, the blacksmith, the preacher, these were her neighbors now. "There is no unpleasantness to leave behind, Arthur," she said, her voice clear and strong, reaching every corner of the silent room. "Except for the unpleasantness you brought with you from back east." A few people shifted, their expressions turning from simple curiosity to genuine interest. "I am not confused, and I have not been taken advantage of," she continued. "I came to Montana of my own free will, and I married this man of my own free will. I was a ghost in my father's house, a convenience he no longer had a use for. Here," she said, turning her head to look at Silas, a small, real smile touching her lips. "I am a partner. I am a wife. This is my life, a life I have earned with my own two hands. And I will not have it dismissed or devalued by you or anyone else." Silas moved to her side and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It was the first time he had ever touched her with such open possession and affection in public. The gesture was unmistakable. "She is my wife," Silas said, his voice a low, steady rumble that tolerated no argument. "The matter is closed." Covington's face was a mask of fury. He had lost. He had tried to use the power of public shame, and Ilara had turned it back on him, claiming her story with a dignity he could not touch. He turned on his heel without another word and stormed out of the store. The silence he left behind was broken by the store owner's wife. "Well then, Mrs. Blackwood," she said, a warm, approving smile on her face. "Can I get you some of that bolt of blue calico you were admiring last month?" The spell was broken. The whispers turned to murmurs of respect. That evening was the town's spring dance. Ilara had never expected to go. But Silas, after they had loaded their supplies, looked at her and said, "I believe we have an engagement." At the dance, held in the town hall, Silas led her to the floor. He was not a graceful dancer, and neither was she, but it didn't matter. As he held her, circling the floor under the warm lantern light, she felt the last of her old life fall away. She was no longer the forgotten daughter, the pitied spinster. She was Ilara Blackwood, in her husband's arms, in the heart of her home, finally and completely visible. Time on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, marked by the turning of seasons rather than the ticking of a clock. The shadow of Arthur Covington and her father faded, a bitter memory from a distant life. They never returned. A letter from her sister Clara arrived nearly a year later. It was filled with stilted apologies and news that their father had passed away peacefully in his sleep. He had, in his final months, spoken of Alara with a strange, regretful pride, telling Clara's friends about his daughter, who had been brave enough to build a life in the Wild West. Alara read the letter, folded it neatly, and felt not grief, but a quiet sense of release. She mourned the father she should have had, not the one she did. She forgave him, not for his sake, but for her own, letting go of the last anchor that tied her to a life of being undervalued. The ranch thrived under their joint care. Her meticulous bookkeeping and clever management, combined with Silas's deep knowledge of the land and the cattle, created a prosperity neither could have achieved alone. The house, once a hollow shell, filled with the warmth of their shared existence. She planted a garden of hardy perennials by the porch, roses and lavender that survived the harsh winters, and their scent filled the summer air. The small wooden horse Silas had carved for his son found a place on the mantelpiece, no longer a symbol of pure grief, but a quiet reminder of the love that had laid the ranch's foundation. Finn, the young ranch hand, grew into a capable young man under their guidance, looking at Silas with hero worship and at Alara with a fierce, filial devotion. He was the son they never had, and their quiet, steady affection for him helped to heal the parts of their hearts that had been broken by loss. They were a family, not one born of blood, but one forged in shared work, mutual respect, and a love that had grown slowly and steadily, like the deep-rooted prairie grass. Their days were not easy. There were droughts and blizzards, market slumps and sick animals, but they faced it all together. Their love was not a thing of whispered sweet nothings or grand romantic gestures. It was in the way he brought her a cup of coffee in the pre-dawn chill. It was in the way she knew exactly how to mend his favorite worn-out jacket. It was in the comfortable silence they could share on the porch after a long day, watching the sun set fire to the mountains, their shoulders just barely touching. One afternoon, 3 years after she had first stepped off that train, a circuit photographer came through Redemption. Silas insisted they have a portrait made. In the photograph, Alara stood beside her seated husband, her hand resting on his shoulder. She was 41 years old. The lines on her face were deeper now, etched by sun and wind and worry. But her eyes were clear and calm, and there was a quiet confidence in her posture. Silas looked directly at the camera, his expression no longer grim or guarded, but suffused with a deep, settled contentment. They looked like what they were: partners, equals, two halves of a whole, rooted deeply in the land they now both called home. The peace they had found was not a gift. It was a thing they had built together, with their own hands, day by difficult, beautiful day. It was earned. I often think about the woman I was, the one who wrote that letter in a cold, lonely room in Ohio. She was so afraid. She thought her life was over, that all the good years had been used up in service to someone who didn't see her at all. She measured her worth by her age, by the number on the calendar, because that's how the world had taught her to measure it. A Woman of 38 was a story that had already been told, its ending written and its cover closed. But the world was wrong. My life didn't end at 38. In many ways, it was just beginning. Out here under this vast, open sky, a person's worth isn't measured in years. It's measured in what you can do, in the strength of your hands and the truth of your word. It's measured by your willingness to get up before the sun and face whatever the day brings. Be it a blizzard, a drought, or a man from your past who thinks he can tell you who you are. Silas never once saw me as old. He saw me as strong. He didn't care about the years I had lived before I met him. He cared about the years we could build together. He didn't want a young, pliable girl he could shape. He wanted a partner who could stand beside him, who already knew her own mind. He saw the lie I told about my age for what it was, not a deception, but an act of survival, a desperate bid for a life of purpose, and he honored that. He gave me a place where my purpose could take root. Tonight, I sit on this porch, the same porch I first saw as a symbol of everything barren and lonely. Silas is beside me, his hand resting over mine on the arm of the rocker. The scent of the roses I planted drifts on the evening air. Finn is down at the corral, softly singing to a new foal. This is my home. This is my family. My value was never tied to my youth or my ability to bear children. It was here all along, inside me. It was in my mind that could balance a ledger and my hands that could save a calf. It was in my heart that could endure being invisible and still learn to love. I just needed to find a place where I was finally allowed to be seen. A life isn't a single, straightforward story that ends when you reach a certain age. It's a series of chapters, and sometimes the very best one doesn't even start until you're brave enough to turn the page yourself.